Recency of practice is an important concern for all medical practitioners in Australia, but it's a difficult concept to understand. So in this video, I'm going to explain what recency of practice is and how it affects both international doctors as well as locally trained doctors. Hi there guys, I'm Dr. Anthony Llewellyn, the career doctor. Whether you're watching me on YouTube, LinkedIn or Facebook, I'm here to help you manage your medical career. So recency of practice is something you must address both when you register with the Medical Board of Australia for the first time, but you also do it each and every time you apply for re-registration, which is every 12 months. So most doctors tend to focus on the Medical Board standard in relation to recency of practice. And whilst that's understandable, you will also find that employers have their own expectations and standards around recency of practice. So in this video, I'm going to guide you through what you need to know about recency of practice so that you can be appropriately addressing this issue both with the Medical Board as well as with employers. And towards the end of the video, I will cover a few of the more commonly asked questions about recency of practice. So stick around for that section. Also, check out the related blog post where you can find a lot of the information and research that I put into this video. Now, you may have a question about recency of practice. Perhaps you are struggling to understand it or not sure if it affects you personally. If so, feel free to leave me a comment below. Okay, on with the video. First of all, let us define what we mean by recency of practice for doctors in Australia. So, according to the Medical Board of Australia, every registered medical practitioner is required to demonstrate recency of practice, which is defined as working within a minimum of 4 weeks full-time within your scope of practice in 1 year, that's one registration period, or 12 weeks full-time within your scope of practice across a 3-year period, that's 3 registration periods. From an employment perspective, whilst employers do need to be mindful of the Medical Board standard, they will personally apply or generally apply their own standards as well. A good rule of thumb is if it's been more than 2 or 3 years since you've done any significant amount of clinical work, this may be seen as a negative by a prospective employer. So in the rest of this video, we'll discuss some of the more finer details of the recency of practice standard, what might happen if you're found to not be recent enough in practice, as well as the options for addressing recency of practice from both a medical board as well as an employer perspective. So why have a recency of practice standard? Well, I think that we can all agree that it is important that doctors remain current in the type of clinical medicine that they practice. Most lay people would consider a situation where a doctor had, for example, not practiced medicine at all for 5 years and not engaged in any learning during that period as one where such a doctor might pose a risk to the public if they were to return to clinical medicine with no initial support or oversight. The question, therefore, is how much recency of practice is enough recency of practice? And interestingly, the Australian Health Practitioners Regulation Agency, AHPRA, which oversees the national boards, including the Medical Board, has reviewed this question a couple of times. And in their most recent report, they comment that there is no definitive answer to this particular question. AHPRA concluded that the revised registration standards need to balance public safety versus the regulatory burden of allowing practitioners some level of flexibility in their working arrangements. Now, scope of practice is just as important as recency. It's important to note that the Medical Board still expects that doctors do recognise their own limits, even if they have met the recency of practice requirements. They should still be considering if what they are doing is within their current scope of practice, or whether they should be limiting themselves or engaging in some sort of further training, assessment and oversight. Now, scope of practice can also be a bit difficult to define at times. The Medical Board of Australia defines it as follows. Scope of practice means the professional role and services that an individual health practitioner is trained, qualified and competent to perform. Most specialty colleges will have a statement on their website in relation to the type of clinical practice that they consider a fellow of the college can safely engage in as a current fellow of that college. If you're working as an international medical graduate in Australia, you may have some limits on your scope of practice imposed as part of your registration by the Medical Board. Typically, these may be about working in a particular area of medicine or only working in certain locations where supervision is being provided. So, how do you prove recency of practice with the Medical Board of Australia? Well, primarily and firstly, it's an honesty system. Whenever you apply for registration or a new form of registration or apply to re-register, you must indicate to the medical board that you meet the recency of practice standard. The medical board does, however, expect that you keep a record of evidence to prove your recency of practice. And it also indicates that it does from time to time audit for compliance, and it will look into your recency of practice further if it, for example, receives a notification about you. So what can happen if you give the wrong information to the medical board about your recency of practice? Well, in confirming your recency of practice, you're confirming that you actually comply with the law. So deliberately lying about your recency of practice can have very serious consequences if you're found out. Even if you were not deliberately attempting to give bad information about your recency of practice, if it turns out that you were non-compliant, you could still be in trouble. So what happens to your registration if you're not recent enough in your practice? Well, if you don't meet the recency of practice standard, then the board can impose conditions on your registration or even refuse you registration. It's up to you to provide information to the medical board to help the board decide whether you can safely continue with your registration. The requirements vary depending how experienced you are and how long you have been out of practice. You can check out the table here, which I've also provided to you in the related blog post. Now, the conditions vary from no additional requirements being required to being required to submit a full re-entry to practice plan and working supervised for a period of time. For those doctors who are required to catch up with continuing professional development, the easiest path for doing this is via the relevant college CPD program, if you're a member of such a college. For this reason, many IMGs will register with the RACGP for this purpose, although it should be noted that RACGP CPD is technically only relevant to general practice and not hospital medicine, although clearly there is some overlap. Now, if you've been out for more than 3 years and are a member of a college, then you will normally find that the college provides a re-entry program option for you, which will satisfy the medical board requirement. Generally, this will involve working under the oversight of a college fellow for a period of time. Now, what if you're changing your scope of practice? Again, according to the medical board, if you are changing your field or scope of practice, you may need to undertake further training to ensure that you are competent enough. If the change is a subset of your current practice, i.e. you are actually narrowing your current practice, then there's no additional requirement. If you're changing your practice in a way that your peers, your colleagues might view as requiring you to take more training or are changing to an entirely different field of practice, then you will be required by the medical board to consult with a relevant specialist college to develop a professional development plan before entering into the new field of practice. So why do employers have a different interpretation of recency of practice? Well, employers are of course obliged to take the medical board recency of practice standards into account when considering applicants for job applications. However, employers can and often do make their own interpretations around recency of practice. Because working supervised is an option for addressing issues around recency of practice, employers may consider doctors for posts where the doctors have been out of practice for a significant period. But it is my experience, particularly when it comes to trainee doctors and IMGs, international medical graduates, that employers are very unlikely to see large gaps in clinical practice as a positive. Employers usually have several applications to consider, and they will tend to take the easier path of employing a doctor who is either just moving between jobs or has, say, 2 years or less time out of medicine. So what are your options for addressing recency of medical practice? Well, option 1 is to work under supervision to obtain recency of practice. As the medical board itself indicates, if you have a recency of practice issue, then working under supervision is an option for addressing this matter. A key point of this standard is to ensure that doctors who are not recent enough in their practice are given some oversight in return to work. So in theory, this means that if you are applying for a resident or registrar trainee role, recency of practice should not really be an issue from a registration standpoint. But as I've already highlighted, it may cause a problem in terms of your candidacy versus other candidates who do have recency of practice. Option number 2 is to gain some clinical experience elsewhere to gain recency of practice. Working under supervision in Australia is not really an option for you, then your next option is to regain clinical experience by working in another country. The medical board indicates that it considers clinical practice in overseas countries as meeting the standard of recency of practice. So this is generally a good option for most IMGs and something I tend to recommend a lot if they have been more than 2 years away from clinical medicine. I will generally advise that you try to work for 3 months back in your own country or another country where you have registration, as this will then help you to both meet the medical board recency of practice standard as well as to provide some reassurance to employers. So I do hope you've been enjoying the video so far. If you've got a question or a comment about recency of practice, remember you can leave it in the description below. And you can leave me a like on Facebook, LinkedIn or YouTube. And if you are watching on YouTube, please subscribe so you can get notifications about further videos. Finally, as many of you know, I am a coach for other doctors, and I'm going to take you through some of the common questions I get about the recency of practice standard. First question, are courses and observerships useful for recency of medical practice? In a couple of words, not really. Neither really help that much. Certainly from a medical board perspective, observerships do not count as clinical practice towards the recency of practice requirement. Courses may be of assistance if they are requiring you to undertake CPD relevant to your scope of practice. From an employer perspective, a relevant course might help a fractional amount, and an observership may also assist in a very small way. The key benefit of an observership may be that it enables you to nominate a referee who has recent contact with you in the Australian health context. However, the merits of an observership are marginal compared to actual clinical practice from an employer perspective. Who does the recency of practice standard apply to? Well, the recency of practice registration standard applies to all registered medical practitioners, except those with non-practicing registration and recent graduates applying for provisional registration, i.e. interns. Does recency of practice only affect international medical graduates? No. The recency of practice standard affects all medical practitioners seeking registration or re-registration in Australia, including locally trained doctors such as myself. If I work more than 38 hours in a week, can I count these additional hours towards demonstrating recency of practice? No. The medical board says you may only accumulate 38 hours in 1 week. Additional time will not count towards the standard, so you do have to work those 4 weeks of 38 hours. What if I work part-time? Doctors who work part-time must still complete the same minimum number of hours of practice. This can obviously be completed part-time over more weeks. For example, working 20 hours per week for 8 weeks of the year would meet the standard. Does experience overseas count? Absolutely. The medical board accepts practice outside Australia for the purposes of meeting the recency of practice registration standard. So that's all about recency of practice. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.